nation. The rest of the verse says, there is as iniquity and idolatry. And look at this. Here's the pronouncement of judgment that I want you to see. Samuel continues, Saul, because you've rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. It was a steep price tag, wasn't it? Choosing to disobey. That tragic statement there from Samuel to Saul, we're going to pause. We're going to look at the first of just two main points that we'll have today. These are in the insert in your bulletin. Let me give you this first point. First thing that we see here, I think is fairly obvious, and it's this. The consequences of willfully disobeying God are always severe. Right? We like to console ourselves by thinking that, well, the consequences will not be severe, but that's wrong. The consequences of willfully disobeying God are always severe, and Saul is proof. Scripture text in front of us today documents 4 consequences of Saul's disobedience. I want you to log these in, see these. Make sure, by the way, that you understand at this point that disobedience had become the prevailing pattern in Saul's life. So he was going to pay with 4 consequences. Here they are, 4 consequences of Saul's persistent disobedience. Number 1, because of his disobedience, God immediately rejected Saul as king. Verse 23, right? Look at it again. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. Make sure you understand that this was an immediate action that God took. Saul would occupy the throne for many more years, we know that. But that's all he would do. He went from being the legitimate, rightful king of Israel to just simply being the guy that occupied the throne. Because God formally rejects him here. He's not the king anymore. He's just going to be the guy going forward that's going to keep it warm temporarily while awaiting the ascension of its rightful occupant, who was David, who, remember, Saul is going to squander the next several years trying to murder. Saul's disobedience cost him the throne. I want you to also see here that his disobedience meant not just that he would only occupy the throne as a disgraced and rejected king. You should also see here that his rejection of the Lord's word also caused the forfeiture of his dynasty. Recently, Prince, was it William, was married? That was an interesting thing in my household. Rhonda was into that. She was fascinated by that. And she was recording hours and hours and hours of commentary on this wedding. I was just concerned that it was going to get into the way of maybe some sporting events that I had on the DVR. But we really don't understand this whole monarchy thing in America. Because, when you think about it, we've never lived under a king. Not since our independence. I mean, we've never lived under a king. We don't know what it is to have a dynasty. Well, Saul did. Israel was obviously surrounded by monarchies with their own dynasties, and Saul is told here that he's going to forfeit his dynasty. Not going to be any son of Saul that's going to prosper on the throne of Israel. God promises it here. Next verses here, 24 and 25, Saul is superficially then set to begging Samuel's pardon. That's an interesting thing, by the way. Whose pardon should he be begging? God's, right? He's begging Samuel's pardon. But Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you. You see, Samuel needed to accompany Saul for Saul basically to carry that air of legitimacy. Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. Now look at verse 27. As Samuel turned to go, Saul panics, right? He sees the edge of Samuel's robe and it tore. Great object lesson here. So Samuel said to him, verse 28, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you. Understand the consequence? Saul, you're done. Saul, your sons are done. You're not going to have a dynasty. Now look at verse 29. I love this verse. Samuel goes on here. Also, the glory of Israel. That's a great name for God. The glory of Israel, look at this, will not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man that he should change his mind. See what Samuel's saying there? He's saying this is a done deal, Saul. You go back and you look at those verses that precede this, and effectively, Saul had gone to begging. And just to put this in a very cold sort of way, Samuel is saying the deal is done, the ship has sailed, don't beg. You're now illegitimate in God's eyes as king, and as a result of that, no heir of yours is going to prosper on the throne of Israel. It's a harsh consequence, isn't it? What a steep price tag. I don't think we can really grasp that message that Samuel took to. I'll give you three more consequences. Consequence 2. Because of his disobedience to the Lord's word, Saul's relationship with Samuel was destroyed. You know, as you read the narrative from chapter 9 going forward, one of the things that becomes apparent to you is that Samuel loved Saul like a son, didn't he? You can just sort of see this. I mean, think of what they'd been through. Samuel was the one, effectively, who God had chosen to recognize Saul as king. It was a momentous, it was a historic kind of moment. As you read forward from chapter 9, you just get the sense that the hearts of Saul and Samuel were just knitted together, especially early on. Samuel loved Saul. But I want you to make the note here that it was Saul's repeated disobedience to the Lord's word that compromised the relationship and ultimately destroyed it. It's interesting that even then, after all the trouble Saul had caused, that when the end of that relationship was finally announced, that Samuel took it hard. Remember 15, 10, and 11? You want some insight into the way that Samuel loved Saul? Look back, 15, 10. When the word of the Lord came to Samuel saying, I regret that I've made Saul king because he's turned back from following me and has not carried out my commands. Look here at what Samuel's response was. We're told here at the end of verse 11 that Samuel was then distressed. And he cried out to the Lord all night. See, that's certainly sorrow over Saul's failure, to be sure, but I want you to see really that it's sorrow, I think, mostly over that broken relationship. Samuel really loved Saul, and he knew that this was the end of their relationship. He knew that. Look at 15:35. Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death. Look at this. For Samuel grieved over Saul. He didn't even bring himself to go see him. He loved him. He grieved over his failure. I'll give you consequence 3 here. Ready? This is a big one. Consequence 3, Saul's persistent and unrepentant disobedience to the Lord's word ultimately resulted in his own affliction. Look ahead to chapter 16. Try this on for part of the price tag of sin. Chapter 16, we'll look at verse 14. This is after David has been anointed to become king. What we're told here. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. Look, and an evil spirit from the Lord terrorized him. Boy, that's an interesting thing, isn't it? English Standard Version softens that just a little bit there. If you happen to be reading the ESV, it says that a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented Saul. So the ESV kind of knocks the edge off. But you can really only interpret that rather shocking statement in either translation in a couple of ways. Either you can understand there that God sovereignly permitted a demonic spirit to terrorize Saul, or you can choose to say that God gave Saul over to the control of his own sin, and of the control of its own negative psychological consequences. But you know what? In both scenarios, and by the way, the more literal one seems to be the best one, in most scenarios, it was God who orchestrated the affliction. Wasn't it? It was God, you see, who brought the punishment. It was God who produced the calamity that overwhelmed Saul's life because of his sin. God punishes sin, doesn't he? Finally, let me give you here the fourth consequence of Saul's persistent disobedience. The fourth consequence that's documented here in 1 Samuel is that Saul's disobedience morally and ethically destroyed him. Morally and ethically destroyed him. What do you mean by that? I mean to tell you that literally Saul sinned so persistently that his conscience became dull. I think probably most of us have used a knife. You know, you get a knife and it begins sharp and it cuts, it does the thing that it's supposed to do. But you know, if you work hard enough at that knife, you'll dull it to where it no longer cuts. The thing that happened because of his sin, Saul dulled his conscience through sin, and he dulled it to the point that he literally could no longer reliably decipher right from wrong. Saul would look at something that was wrong and think that it was right. He would look at something that was right, and it wouldn't make any sense with him. He would think it was wrong. I can prove this in Saul's life, by the way, that's documented in the rest of the book. Think ahead with me. The fact that he dulled his conscience through sin is the reason that even though David faithfully served him, faithfully ministered to him, still because his conscience was dull, that's why Saul continually sought to murder him. See, he literally no longer understood that murder was wrong, or at least ways he thought that David's murder was right. This is also why Saul became unjustly angry with his son Jonathan in chapter 20. You can look at that. That's why, remember, Saul slaughtered the city of Nob. Remember, he set the sword to it, killed them all. Was angry with the priests because he thought they were sympathetic with David. He went in and killed everybody. He committed really the atrocity on Nob that he refused to commit with the Amalekites. You see, what had been right was wrong. What was wrong was right. The fact that he dulled his conscience through disobedience is also the reason that Saul drove David to live with the Philistines. Chapter 27, remember? It's the reason why at the end of his life that Saul even consulted with a witch. I'm sure you see this morning that Saul did all of those things because he had so dulled his conscience through persistently and unrepentantly sinning against the Lord that he could no longer decipher right from wrong.
The hope of a nation. The Savior, He can move the mountain. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save. Forever, author of salvation. He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered.